Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Vorberg Director's Seminar, the Hans-Würtz-Collection, Unlocking a Unique Body of Disability-Related Images. I'd just like to welcome everybody tonight, and just to say that we will be taking questions at the end, but if anybody wants to raise a question during the process of the talk, please raise that question in the chat box and we'll come round to all the questions at the end. Okay, so your speakers today are myself, Professor Simon Mckeown, and Professor Oliver Musenberg. And we are talking about the collection, the Hans-Würtz-Collection. Specifically, this project became known as Images of Disability, and this is a project that has been running effectively from 2013 to 2026. I'd just like to take a moment to thank our project partners and, of course, their staff and all our contributors and supporters. So I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm a researcher and someone who teaches at the School of Arts and Creative Industries at Teeside University. And additionally, we have Professor Oliver Musenberg, who undertakes research and teaches at the Institute for Rehabilitation Science at Humboldt-Universität in Berlin in the field of education for people with intellectual disabilities. He is also currently the head of the Special Education Archive. I trained in fine art at Northumbria University, and after graduation, I entered the emerging computer graphics industry in London. This was a very exciting period as the technology was just developing, and of course, the business world around that was also developing. Toy Story had not yet been made. After 10 years, I transitioned from television and film to the computer games sector and became an art director on one of Britain's most successful games entitled Driver. I innovate within the world of art and disability, and as a professor of art at Teeside University, I've spent almost the last 15 years creating high-profile collaborative works with disabled artists in places such as Cork Ireland and in St Helens near Liverpool. I'm passionate about disability heritage as well, and I've created both this project, Images of Disability, with Oliver, but additionally I've created disability heritage projects around mobility, in particular a project called The Carrying of Passengers is Forbidden. Professor Oliver Musenberg completed his master's degree in special education and then followed his interest in the history of special education and continued with a PhD doctoral thesis in which he reconstructed the biography of Hans Würtz and his pedagogical and psychological theories towards the education in apostrophe of the cripples. In this context, Musenberg discovered original fragments of the Hans-Würtz collection in Prague-based archives. In 2013, the exhibition Disabled by Normality was presented in Prague at the Dock Centre for Contemporary Art. This landmark exhibition was curated by Yaroslav Andel and Katerina Kalarova with curatorial cooperation from Leos Valka and Michaela Siplikova. It was organized in cooperation with the Elisha Gustav Institute and schools in Prague, along with the National Medical Library. Disabled by Normality was one of Europe's largest and most successful exhibitions on disability. The exhibition featured historic as well as contemporary artworks made by Czech and international disabled artists. And for the first time since 1932, elements of the Hans-Würtz collection were exhibited, including several hundred 2D images and many sculptures. These works came from two Prague archives that house the overall collection. Here we can see some of the original 2D and 3D images in the Docks exhibition space. I was exhibiting in this exhibition, a project called Motion Disabled. And as I looked around the exhibition, I realized the magnitude of the Hans-Würtz-Collection. I became determined to do something about this, and Docs advised me to contact Oliver. And from there, I arranged to meet Oliver in Berlin. And since around about 2013, we've since worked together to bring the collection to public attention. Our first project attempt was via the European Union, and whilst this was unsuccessful, it laid the groundwork for all our work that followed. We successfully applied for funding to the Arts and Humanities Research Council and also the German Research Foundation during COVID in 2021. I'd like to introduce you to the rest of the team as well. We have an amazing team who've all brought their own unique qualities to the project. Central to the project are, of course, our Czech colleagues, which is where most of the Hans-Würtz-Collection is now based. We have worked extensively with Simon Chrysler and Petra Koller, and they're amazing teams. And in the UK, we have recruited provenance researcher Carolina Hizzi, and in Germany, Dr. Sebastian Pampuch to help us. And they have helped organise, digitise and analyse the collection. Dr. Paul Dark has brought his extensive knowledge of disability and video making to the project. Aaron Wardle of Swipe and Tap has provided substantial technical support and with regard to IT and the database. And Andrew Breckel, a digital graduate of Teeside University, has undertook many months of work with me to 3D scan nearly all of the 3D elements of the collection. Lastly, Alice Schrimmer has contributed a great deal of work as a student placement on the project in Berlin. The Hans-Würtz-Collection was subject to 3 exhibitions to date, and only one at the time of its collection in 1932. The first exhibition was held in Berlin by Würtz himself at the institute that he ran. Thereafter, the collection was effectively lost. In 2013, the collection was then uncovered in partnership with Docs, and who showcased parts of the original collection. Not only was Disabled by Normality a fantastic contemporary art exhibition, it also recovered a lost disability and art history. The final exhibition to date was this year, where we made the collection subject of an exhibition at the Humboldt Forum in central Berlin, a location not too far from where the collection had originally been exiled some 90 years before. Considering the history the collection has witnessed, it is amazing that it has actually survived. Lastly, I would just like to introduce our chair and speaker, Rachel Gadsden. Rachel is a British artist who has exhibited internationally and who works across the mainstream and disability art sectors, presenting cross-cultural visual dialogue that considers the most profound notions of what it is to be human. Rachel recently presented on the collection at the York 4 Art History Conference with the rest of the team here today. Before we move on, I thought a short video of our work to date might be useful.
It wasn't so simple because the money he hadn't to decide just by his own. He was just a director, but the institute was run by a company, a kind of private company, which finally made the buy, find out what they meant by a description, because they use as a what is it, Bill? Is it a picture? Is it a paint? Because sometimes the people who did the scanning they could clearly see that some topics were more common in some folders. We have to assume that when the Würtz created that, it was divided by some categories.
I haven't seen a collection like this. If we consider the Institute as well and the whole lot of it, why didn't he first even bother to do it?
He, I think, tried to move away a bit from this medical, orthopedical view on people with disabilities and try to put a more, like you could say, a cultural, historical view.
I mean, even Würtz himself did not let the subjects of his collection speak. That it would be interesting to look at the collection from the point of view of people with disabilities as subjects.
So now we assume there are 3,000, circa 3,000 of these items.
So we decided it looks like that the material is not strong enough any longer, so we decided to change the whole frame. And also the restoration, she did it really good because it was looking horrible.
Yeah, you can see it from both sides. So you have, what is it, 2, 4, 6, 8 times 32. 32. Correct? No, it's more, it's 74. 64. 64. If you're in the exhibition, it's quite large. So a big issue is how do we, make them visible for visitors, because it's so dark you almost can't see them. But on the other hand, you can't use too much light because it's sensitive object.
A woman without arms must have achieved some prominence at the time when she was living.
Semesters were similar on images of the collection ones or some of these images.
All in all, those few plates here are in a better shape than the
So there's no water damage to the plate, for instance. The fact that they've survived because we've not filled the glass.
Can you do it now?
And at this point, I'd like to now switch over to Oliver.
Thank you, Simon, and hello from Berlin again to everybody, and apologies for the bad quality of the video. As we are speaking at the Warburg Institute today, we should discuss some of the similarities between Warburg and Würtz. Both had a close connection to Hamburg. Both were collectors in their own way. Both of their collections had to leave Nazi Germany, Warburg's Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek and Würtz's image collection. Both were interested in images and in the grouping of images and collected and arranged or grouped primarily reproductions. It was about what was depicted, less about the artistic original. I think, but that's, I think, was it with the parallels? Though Würz was 54 years old when Abi Warburg died in 1929, the two were unknown to each other, and as far as I know, or Warburg Institute, Würz never referred to Warburg. Abi Warburg used images for deeper analysis and theory development in the history of art and culture. Würz did develop theories and ideas on disability. However, his most useful contribution is the collection. Würz used some of the collection to illustrate his ideas of disability, which were to some extent focused around success and work. For example, the working, tax-paying disabled worker in contrast to the disabled beggar or the disabled sideshow artist. Würz was driven by an enormous practical passion for collecting and enthusiasm for his subject physical disability. In this sense, he contributed and created the basis for new knowledge on the visual presentation of disability and how it has existed through time, and he was aware that his collection should in the future be used by teachers and any other disciplines. Hans Würtz was born 1875 and grew up on the northernmost edge of Germany. He worked as a primary school teacher in Hamburg, where he entered a circle of education reformers. In 1910, he moved to Berlin, and a year later was appointed director of education at the Berlin-Brandenburg Cripple Healing and Education Center in Berlin-Kreuzberg, founded by orthopedist Konrad Bisalski. As the institution expanded, it moved to a new building complex in Berlin-Dahlem, developing into the center of German-speaking, using the old-fashioned term cripple care under the name Oskar-Lehnerheim. On the one hand, his educational concepts were driven by his now unusual and so-called cripple psychology that overemphasized the willpower to overcome disability. On the other hand, however, and more usefully, Würz imported elements of early progressive education into the teaching and education of disabled children and young people and maintained contact with numerous reformist educators in Berlin. Würz attributed disabled people with a strong inclination toward negative emotions and adverse personal characteristics like envy, anger, or mistrust. Würz's reflections on speculations were, however, not as extremist as they might seem to today's reader, and remained anchored in the mainstream psychology and pedagogy of the first half of the 20th century. We can see Würz as a complex person. His work with the collection was exemplary and hugely important in both social and art context, locations where images of disabled people are often limited or non-existent or contentious. Würz's career as an educator was abruptly halted by the Nazi regime when the so-called political unreliable were forced to leave their employment. Würz was a social democrat and a Freemason. The new governor of the Disability Institute saw Würz as a philo-Semite and a Jewish lackey. Ultimately, a corruption scandal was staged with the help of the regime-loyal employees at the Oskar-Lehner home, and everything was blown up in the newspapers. And this finally led to his loss of employment and immigration to Prague. After so-called protective custody and pre-trial detention, Würz and his wife finally immigrated to Czechoslovakia in 1934, where he was supported by his Czech colleague Augustin Bartoš, who worked at the Jedlička Institute for the Physically Disabled near Vyšehrad Castle in Prague, which was founded in 1913 by the surgeon Rudolf Jedlička. After moving several times, the pedagogue and his wife took the Munich Agreement of 1938 and the resulting forced separation of the Sudeten territories from Czechoslovakia as an opportunity to leave Czech exile. The couple went to Vienna, Rosalie Würz's hometown, even though the so-called Anschluss of Austria to Nazi Germany had already been completed. In 1932, Würz published the book Zerbrech die Krücken, Smash the Crutches or Break the Crutches, which serves as a catalogue for the biggest part of his collection. Socrates, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Leonardo da Vinci, and even the Nazi minister Joseph Goebbels are all on his lists of the crippled and mutilated, which can be found in here. This book reads like a disabled who's who in the intellectual history of Europe, and at the same time, it is an inventory of the vast collection of images and sculptures of cripples assembled by Würtz during his lifetime. Before the First World War, Würtz began to compile his primarily Western Eurocentric iconography of physical disabilities into a collection of several thousand images. The motifs range from the figure of Teeside in Greek mythology to the peg-legged captain in an early Mickey Mouse movie. The collection comprises reproductions of lithographs, engravings, drawings, photographs, and paintings, but also 180 sculptural representations, bronze, ivory, wood, and porcelain. Würtz also collected novels featuring disabled protagonists, such as, for example, Quasimodo in Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris. However, all the books have been lost. Würtz found all the objects in his collection in second-hand bookshops and junk stores, in the art trade and at auctions and cellars and attics, but above all in books and magazines from which he cut out pictures or had reproductions made. The pictures were then provided with a passepartout frame and a caption. Here you can see an example of such a passepartout picture frame. It shows Voltaire, introduced in the signature as a writer and philosopher and also as ugly. Ugliness was one of Würtz's triple categories. Here's another example of a photograph showing the famous Prussian-born entertainer Karl Hermann Untarn, who plays the violin with his feet, writes on a typewriter, shoots a rifle, etc., and achieved fame in Europe and America. In the book Zerbrech die Krücken, Break the Crutches, Würtz presents different so-called cripple types, which he also used to systematize his collection. In addition to the definition of the cripple in the German Cripple Care Act from 1920, Würtz made his own curious subdivisions based on personal outward appearance, including over-under average height, disproportion, and, as I mentioned, ugliness. In 1938, with the support of his wife and Czech colleagues, Würtz succeeded in transferring the collection from Berlin into exile in Prague and selling it to the local National Association for Cripple Healing and Education at the Elichka Institute. Despite contractual assurances of the right to repurchase the collection, Würtz was unable to buy it back during and after the Second World War. In the book, Joseph Goebbels is mentioned 2 times as an example in the chapters Revolutionary Politicians and German Reich. And part of the collection is also this cartoon, which prominently features Goebbels' clubfoot. It was published in the left-wing magazine Die Ente in November 1932. 2 months earlier, in September 1932, Würtz presented his collection in a large exhibition in the rooms of the Oskar-Lehner home in Berlin-Dahlem. Numerous reviews of the exhibition can be found in the Berlin Daily Press. And finally, after the end of the war, Würtz returns with his wife to destroyed Berlin, and he died in 1958. The collection is unique and survived World War II, bombing and flooding along the vast societal change, Nazism, communism, and 1989 Velvet Revolution. The collection was split into 2 elements in Prague in the 1970s, with the largest part of the collection is in the historical archive of the Elichka Institute in Prague. A smaller part, which includes all the sculptures, was transferred in the communist era to the National Medical Library in Prague in the 1970s and is archived there still. And the third location is the Special Education Archive here in Berlin at Humboldt-Universität. After the Second World War, boxes with thousands of glass negatives have been found in the basement of the destroyed Oskar-Lehner home, together with a few other images, manuscripts, and letters assembled by Würtz's widow Rosa. This material became the so-called Hans-Würtz archive. Approximately 1,100, 1,200 glass negatives have been restored and digitized and will be made digitally accessible within the digital collections of the Humboldt-University, along with around 100 2D images. Today, the collection comprises 3,142 pictures, 14 oil paintings, 175 sculptures, and approximately 1,200 glass plate negatives. And here you can see how the numbers of items in the collection changed over the years. Its status in March 1933 is very important because it gives an indication of how much has been taken from, lost, or damaged from the collection. Where are these items now and how have they been distributed? Can we consider theft under different regimes and in different locations, or simply neglect? These are open questions. And on the next slide here, you can see just how it goes on, and that we are today again with a number it started with. And here, just to have a few more impressions of images and sculptures. Here we see exquisite ivory carvings, which may be from Dieppe in France, or at least based on the Dieppe school, which depict forms of work in the disabled flower selling as well as methods of motion. And more, for instance, disabled beggars. The next step is to talk a bit about recompiling and analyzing the collection. In the following, I refer in particular to the work of our colleague Sebastian Pampuch in our project. In our exhibition in Berlin this year, we developed various thematic tableaux, 3 of which were dedicated to the theme of work, which you can see here on the left. On the right, we see an image by UK social realist artist Ernest Wadley. The ability to work was the all-important goal towards which Hans-Würtz geared his educational objectives. In view of social climate in which social Darwinism, eugenics, and class struggle clashed, as well as a sharp rise in the number of disabled people as a result of war and industrial work, the aim was to enable these people to do paid work. Severely disabled people were left out of the equation. The contemporary disability movement also used such exclusionary arguments, partly. Fittingly, the collection contains remarkably few depictions of disability that are clearly recognizable as the result of accidents at work or unhealthy working conditions, although such images were widespread in the context of social struggles. The colored woodcut, the one-legged man on crutches, was commissioned by Henry Hilsley, London. It was used to illustrate an announcement flyer for a charity event for war invalids who exhibited and sold their handicrafts at the Imperial Institute in London in cooperation with the British Legion. Viewing disabled people as curiosities or freaks is an integral part of Western cultural history. From a historical perspective, entertainment culture is therefore one of the areas in which people with disabilities may have been able to make a living and achieve a certain degree of autonomy. The display of one's own body often went hand in hand with the presentation of artistic skills. Through background research and contextualization, that images showing victims of child labor can be identified in the Würtz collection, such as this photograph of the American tap dancer Clayton Bates. Bates' photos appear in the Würtz collection only as those of a disabled entertainer lost his leg at the age of 12 in an accident while working in a cotton mill. Depicting people with disabilities as beggars became established in European art in the 15th century at the latest. These are predominantly male figures whose experiences ranges from weak and sick to vital and athletic. The link between disability and begging suggests an understanding of poverty that emerged in the late Middle Ages and was measured by the ability to work. While physical impairments justified beggar status, neediness was henceforth illegitimate in the case of non-disabled people. As the iconography of the beggar cripple shows, physical disability became a precarious social capital at this time. In the 20th century, the figure of the equally male and begging war invalid developed into an ubiquitous motive in contemporary art, continuing the prominence of the earlier figure. Here you can see again a painting from the collection that Würtz called Beggar, Cripple with Lady. It shows a disabled but still manly and daring looking man on crutches with a wooden leg and torn clothes, who seems to be walking or dancing arm in arm with an attractive lady who looks a little drunk or high, emphasized by a glass of wine and a pipe in her left hand. Here we are using software Mckeown to assist in analyzing the images, and the approach here is so-called visual grounded theory. In the first step, we code parts or figures that seem particularly relevant to us, commenting on them if necessary. This produces a hierarchical coding structure ranging from top-level categories such as difference to subcategories such as class and labor, gender, disabled, intoxication, etc. This is a complex image open to interpretation. Here you can see how some of the comments serve as memos for the codes. For example, the question of whether the woman is under threat or being helped by disabled men, and whether the woman's style represents drunk happiness or reveals a connection with prostitution. We can also ask why one of the two figures is the larger, or how being a beggar is visualized. Finally, is this the road to perdition or misery, or to safety? Another approach we tried was figurative hermeneutics. This is more about grouping images with images from outside of the collection. And this is maybe enough for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver.
Thank you. So our initial research questions on the project, when we started Images of Disability, we set out 5 or 6 key questions. We asked how the thematic detail of the collection could be described, captured and catalogued. We asked how impairment and disability is represented and staged in the collection across the whole assemblage and through closer investigation of key items. We asked how the understanding of the collection alters when viewed diachronically and synchronically, and we asked about our interpretation, where our interpretation of the collection can lead us to a new visual typology of disability. What role can creative research, i.e. exhibition curation, video, new art production around the collection, what role that can play in revitalizing identities, processes, or alternative versions of disability? Let's continue with the begging theme for now and look at the most famous figure in the Northern Renaissance, the 16th century Netherlandish artist Peter Bruegel the Elder. The Beggars, also known as the Cripples or the Legless, was painted in 1568 by Peter Bruegel. Bruegel was one of the first artists to depict everyday life, and he painted village scenes that included disabled people using handmade crutches. This was something quite unusual at the time. His work is often layered with symbolism and satire, and it's difficult, therefore, to interpret. The Beggars is no exception, and its meaning is still debated today. Würtz held a much later derivative copy of this work, which he valued highly, placing it at the start of his exhibition catalogues of Echte But what does a close reading of this painting, which is now held in the Louvre, tell us? Looking at this painting through a modern lens is challenging. I see echoes of my own experience, my disabled grandfather, disabled friends, and the young motorbike injured amputees I spent time with in hospital during my youth. I see friends supporting each other on a shared adventure, kinship and camaraderie in this tightly bound group. What stands out to me, though, are the mobility aids, which remind me of modern wheelchairs or modern crutches. These crutches aren't crude or hastily made, though. These crutches in the painting are carefully crafted, they're practical and designed with thought and expertise. The second character from the left has a protrusion pointing forwards, for instance, from just below his knee. This is very useful when you consider the person has no feet. This suggests that these individuals were not simply destitute beggars in a modern sense, but rather people who had or perhaps still were very well cared for. Further, the loss of limbs is striking, and some interpretations of medieval history suggest that they may have been former soldiers. However, as recently as 2020, the Louvre in Paris described this painting as a pitiless description of human degradation. I would disagree. Since then, the Louvre has softened and simplified its interpretation. Ultimately, how we view any artwork depends on our own perspective and experiences and our own cultural baggage. The extraordinary verse collection with over 3,500 images, to which the beggars is the figurehead, challenges to analyse and question how society has historically viewed and continues to view disability. So how did we approach such a vast collection? The first thing we did was to scan in 2D and 3D the whole collection as we knew it at the time. Here we see volunteer Michael Dusek from the scanning team at the Ulice Gustav in Prague scanning the 2D works. Separately, we work with the National Medical Library and their team to receive their previously scanned 2D materials, which we merged into one database. Further, we scanned in 3 dimensions all the sculptural objects. Here we can see the scanning process developed by Teeside University computer graphics graduate Andrew Breckhill, along with myself. We are using a darkened tent, a turntable, and a high-resolution camera, along with photogrammetry software, combined with 3D object delivery software to undertake 400 photographs per object. We scanned nearly all of the 3D collection except the white porcelain objects, which were then later turned into 3D web objects. During the content generation phase, we also added categorization data. We didn't, however, follow the structures set out by Wurst. We developed our own structures and knowledge, and in doing so, we began to understand the depth and the importance of the collection. We had metadata and categorization to all images, and at the same time created a top 500 to make our process more manageable. We didn't need, for instance, 20 similar images of Napoleon when only one would suffice. Here we can see a breakdown of the objects per type. It's important to remember that this is what remains of the collection, which we believe was originally over 7,000 items. And these statistics are from the top 500. So we've got distribution by gender, and we also worked on the types of impairment depicted. It's important to use these taxonomies because we can relate to them, and we can also then understand the presentation of disability in culture and society over time, whilst being mindful of an overtly medical gaze. We can, as a result, see that learning disability, including Down syndrome, is not apparent in our top 500 images. This tells us that perhaps Wurst wasn't interested in learning disability, or that society and artists in general weren't either. Thematically, the collection is also very interesting, and while this is very subjective, the metadata reveals a broad thematic approach led by portraiture. Here we can see the top 11 themes by frequency and percentage. One of my favourite categories is musicians, who are represented often in cartoonish ways inspired by the 17th century French artist Jacques Collot. We find ceramics, metal and ivory musicians in the collection, often exquisitely produced. Here we can see a screenshot of the 3D database behind the Wurst project, and you can see in the centre there a cartoonish musician playing an instrument. What we've built and what comes next. Today we created a website which we update. We've attended many presentations and conferences, most recently at the Four Art History Conference in York, where we presented a panel on disability in art. We have created an exhibition which we delivered in Berlin, and we have restored and delivered glass negatives for exhibition. Our future plans include an anthology, further conferences and conference papers, website update, and further funding to make the digital work we have undertaken publicly accessible. Finally, we will be undertaking further exhibitions in the UK, in multiple locations, and also in the Czech Republic. One of the most symbolic things we achieved is the returning of the collection to Berlin almost 90 years after it was deemed of no value by the National Socialists at the time and exiled to Prague. That we were able to position this exhibition in the Humboldt Forum, which is one of Germany's most important and successful museums. It is really important to me, especially given that it's relatively close to the Reichstag, which was the cause of its exile. I feel this is very culturally significant. Here we see a small selection of the large glass negatives, which miraculously survived the destruction of World War II in Berlin, now displayed and restored at the Humboldt Forum. First had, we believe, a significant photographic studio at his institute, and the slides that we have document life in the institute, as well as the 1932 exhibition, the exhibition that was the cause of so much personal trouble to Würst in later years. In only the third time ever, images and sculptures from the collection were presented at Humboldt Laboratory, and to do this, we made use of the large space using display panels with prints and text board, organizational pieces in passepartouts or picture frames, original pieces, sorry, 3D digitization of statues, 3D prints, and we also showed an original black and white film from the time of Würst in the Institute. We also were able to use a 35mm carousel to show some original slides, color slides from the 1960s. And further, we were able to show two artworks from two artists with learning disabilities who responded to the collection. We developed thematic areas of concern, and each grouping was presented and supported by text, and for instance, audio discussion of via QR codes. In this panel, The Cripple and the Future, we see a 1927 ink drawing by Elizabeth Busek, part of a postcard series introduced by the first Austrian Cripple Labour Union. Her artwork is held in the Hans-Würtz-Collection at the National Medical Library in Prague and depicts the beginning of an emancipatory disability movement in Germany. Further analysis and ideas. The Hans-Würtz-Collection is an extraordinary assemblage of images of disability. Our researchers revealed that the collection was double its current size, and what happened to the rest is not fully understood. What we haven't fully unpacked is Rosa Würst's role in all of this. We believe she was fundamental to the collection financially, for instance, and also its survival in the Special Education Archive in Berlin. The collection includes many cartoons, and these can be problematic in that cartooning was used across the whole of the political spectrum in Germany in the 1930s. As such, it can be difficult to analyze an image without knowing its provenance. In this case, we see a National Socialist image. We see communism in the form of an old disabled Medusa being let into the plenum. In this case, the Reichstag, or more broadly, the German political world, by a surprised or alarmed looking Weimar Republic official. In looking at the collection, we can relate it to mainstream culture. Here we can see an online fanzine about an armless tiger man. This is from the Marvel Comics Golden Age villains, which is described in the following interesting story. Gustav Hertz was a young German boy working in a factory until his arms got caught in a machine. He lost both his arms, but learned how to use his teeth and his feet in the same manner as his arms. Hertz developed an extreme hatred for machines and was sent by the Gestapo to America in order to destroy machines. After committing a brutal murder, the angel was then sent after the armless Tiger Man. The angel's chase culminated in the battle, where the angel defeated the armless Tiger Man and handed him over to the police. Armless Tiger Man was created by Paul Gustafsson and Al Bellman and first appeared in the 1941 Marvel's mystery comic and has since become one of Marvel's most infamous and bizarre characters. It's important to note that in disability studies, Rosemary Garland Thompson in particular has drawn attention to the supercrypt narrative and the portrayal of people with disabilities as superheroes or as victims. And the armless Tiger Man is definitely one of the more bizarre supercrypts. In our Berlin exhibition, we commissioned a cartoon from Oscar Joe Fabritz to conceive the beggar's image in a new light. Here he has added a new context to the characters, which includes a working day. Interestingly, the characters are conceived as working and not simply begging, and we see a common story, that of the normal day at work. Why does any of this matter? Briefly, the United Nations recognises the right of persons with disabilities to take part on an equal basis with others in cultural life and shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that persons with disabilities are fully involved in culture. Statistically, we can see that many people in Britain and across the world are connected to disability. The figures are quite large, up to 25%. So what we know and what we don't know is an interesting question from our work in the collection. Verse and Rosa's work, we assume, again, their curatorial approach was much more considered than we initially thought. Verse was a curator on a grand scale. He had a vision and he curated the most encyclopedic studies of art connected to disability that we know. The collection demonstrates that disability was in the past understood across many visual forms, and that artists were engaged in creating representations of disabled people, whether faithful, fanciful, or cruel. Understanding the provenance of the collection this big has been incredibly challenging. With so many objects missing from the inventory, can we say that a photograph of an object may have been an original that he owned, or are these simply photographs of items borrowed to be photographed, or even photographs of photographs? There are key objects in the collection that are not easily understood, for instance, as well. There is an ivory carving of a dwarf woman with a spider tattooed on her stomach. We do not know who made these objects either, and whether any of them were made by disabled people, and therefore whose eyes are the designs made for and by. How ableist is the collection? What we do know, and this has been highlighted by Dr. Alexander Morris, is that verse was far more enlightened than Egyptologists, for instance, at the same time. Here we have an example of a problem I raised earlier. Here we have on the left a photograph of a copy of a painting, and on the right we have the original painting in the collection. It's first called this an invalid and a dandy, and we think it was from around 1845. The artist is unknown, but perhaps is Ludwig van Hagen. But here we see both a copy and the original, and we do wonder how many originals have disappeared from the collection. Beyond statistics and legalism, by not utilising disability in a creative way, we are reducing our knowledge and experience. by excluding the disabled experience from our cultural lives. Many people acquire impairments in life, and it makes sense to represent this experience just as it does regarding gender or ethnicity. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's ideas from his work Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste in 1979 are still valid. In this, he argues that art is not a neutral entity, but rather one that reflects and reinforces the power structures of society. In this sense, Bourdieu's insights about the social function of art are invaluable for understanding how disability is being portrayed or often marginalized within artistic and cultural domains. Bourdieu stresses that the cultural sphere is not just an aesthetic judgment, but also tied to the broader social dynamics. In the context of disability, the art world has often failed to provide a space for disabled artists themselves to tell their own stories. Bourdieu's perspective helps us situate art not only as an aesthetic object, but also as an instrument through which social distinctions are made. The seminal report and others similar, buried in the footnotes, have found that objects relating to disabled people are present in large numbers in museum stores. Despite the richness of the material in museum collections, the items displayed were, with few exceptions, found in the buried in the footnotes report to be limited in both quantity and scope. The displayed material tended to reinforce stereotypical roles of disabled people in society, and the report highlights evidence through material history, artifacts, and art that disabled individuals were teachers, coopers, miners, musicians, linguists, quilters, embroiderers, painters, and so on. This evidence gives museums the potential to challenge and reconsider expectations that disability equates to a limited contribution to society by demonstrating how diverse and potentially influential roles of disabled people have been in the past. And as of 2025, we can now start to see change. As I highlighted in the review of the Beggar's painting, the original Louvre description of the work the original Louvre description of that work was very poor. Unfortunately, this is built on a sense of tradition of traditionalist ableist critique. Here I can highlight, for instance, the well-known writer Susan Sontag. Her work in critiquing the photographer Diane Arbus, and especially her images of disabled individuals, is quite surprising. She calls these disabled individuals grotesque and pitying. Sontag's language in her work on photography is filled with judgment and discomfort, which exemplifies the ableism that continues to permeate cultural discussions of disability. There are changes, and here in the UK, the V&A have just launched a major exhibition entitled Design and Disability, and other major museums are considering similar large-scale works. The collection holds immense cultural value and offers a wealth of unexplored material for the analysis of historical images of the imagination of impairment and disability. Würtz addressed this concern in his lifetime, arguing that my collection should mainly serve as an impulse for literary and religion historians, art researchers, philosophers, psychologists, educators, poets, playwrights, and novelists. Progressive sections of the Berlin press commented that the collection was unique and demanded the attention of a museum. And with that, I'd like to conclude and offer my thanks to all of the Images of Disability team and its supporters, and my thanks to Professor Bill Sherman, of the director of the Warburg Institute, and to John Milliton, also of the Warburg Institute. And I'd now like to hand over to Rachel Gadsden, sample lecture, and to conclude and hand over to our chair and speaker, internationally exhibiting contemporary disabled artist Rachel Gadsden. She will now offer her thoughts on the collection and lead the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Simon and Oliver. It's a really fascinating collection, and I sort of feel quite privileged because I've already had quite an insight into the collection as part of being part of the panel at the recent conference in York, where the subject of Würtz's collection was really highlighted through the speakers. My particular paper that was selected by Oliver and Simon was Post-Human Disability, Art Practice and Cultural Activism. And I was actually looking at Würtz's collection from the perspective of posthumanism and the work that I've done as a contemporary disabled artist. When I first saw the collection, I was really quite horrified, because trying to be a contemporary disabled artist to make sure that contemporary voices are out there, and the way that we look at disability now changes from the medical model. Of course, we see all of these old medical models within the collection, and we see people often represented in a way that, as contemporary disabled individuals, we don't necessarily want to be represented in that way. So I sort of looked at it and was sort of a bit taken aback. But I have to confess, my serious work around disability began by going into different asylum hospitals right the way across Great Britain. I spent 5 years investigating asylum hospitals, and the whole context of the Oscar Helena Heim village, or town as it was, fascinated me. And here was Oscar collecting this extraordinary collection of art, and I found a lot of art within the asylum hospital made by the actual individuals who were there in their art therapy sessions, or just as part of therapeutic purposes. So how do I look at the collection now, and why has it been so important for me? As a cultural activist and somebody who spent most of my career trying to make sure that that disabled voices are represented, I've worked on many projects in Palestine, Hong Kong, all over the world, South Africa, trying to make sure that disabled voices are heard. And one of the biggest things that I noticed from all my collaborators is they always want to see representations of themselves in art history. And they say, show us some pictures, because somehow I'm supposed to be very knowledgeable, which I'm not always that knowledgeable. And I've realized that this collection really does have the most significant historical context on knowing that disabled people have existed for many, many years from an artistic perspective, and that they have been, individuals have been created in an artistic capacity, whether it's through sculptures, drawing, cartoons. And since I started going through the collection, I even began to realize that a lot of the images that I've created don't look that dissimilar from images that exist within the collection, and the way I've drawn different people that I want to represent. And they may not always be politically as correct as we would now like them to be, because culture's changed and how we view disability has changed. For me, this collection is probably one of the most collections I've ever seen as part of my practice, and how my practice will go on into the future. My research that I'm undertaking at Humboldt-Universität as part of a PhD is investigating the extent to which perceptions of mortality emerging from the lived experience may influence the process and the intention of the disabled artist practice. I'm also seeking to articulate through practice-based research how disability art may be a defining tool to advocate a social and cultural empowerment and activism. And as I've got to know more about Würtz, I've realized that he was a man who really wanted to put disability center stage, and to make sure that disabled people were seen, I think from his perspective, always in a very positive way. And he looked around constantly. I mean, nobody can amass a collection like he did. It's extraordinary the amount of time that must have gone into trying to create this collection. And I think he looked at the collection in such a way that sometimes he was probably very aware that some of the imagery that was there might be difficult for some people. But if we take it back to the period that it was being collected, the fact that they were even in magazines or in public, or sculptures were being created, was really significant. So for me, as I continue to learn more about the different works, I realized that it is probably one of the most important collections that exists. Well, it is in disability, and how the representation of disability individuals have been shown in this collection. We may do it differently now. We may show it slightly differently now. And purposely, from my own research point of view, I'm tending to really look and use exemplar from 2012 onwards, because that's really where the lived experience of disability becomes so prominent in researchers and people who've created work. So what I ask everybody now is, I'm sure many of you will have some questions to maybe give your own viewpoints about what you feel about the collection. I'd be really grateful for anybody here who's watching to maybe ask questions to Oliver and to also Simon, you know, any thoughts you might have of the collection and how you see the collection. But in the first instance, probably what I might like to just suggest as a starting point, I know that the whole education process that we know in UK is special education, where people are locked away and were locked away and separated from other people in society. There's a whole different process in the way the German relationship with education has worked. So Simon and Oliver, could you just give a background to the special school, which obviously Oscar Helena Heim, this village that evolved, and this whole education system differs from UK, because I think that would be a really good leveling point just to start with, so we know where we're coming from. And I do welcome any questions, and let's take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oliver, I'll let you answer the description on
the landscape of special schools in Germany is still very special. That means that we have loads of special schools, that we talk a lot about inclusion, but when it comes to the reality, we see inclusion rising, but we see also the numbers of pupils in special schools rising at the same time. So we have an increase of labeling. So this is really I think this is maybe a different situation in Britain. I'm not sure. So it's some kind of a progress and a rollback at the same time at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I think it is different. So in the UK, sort of, to become a teacher of disabled people, you specialise after you've done your teaching degree. You may fall into it. You may become a SEND teacher by accident and this kind of thing. And this is outside the realm of therapy, shall I say? Whereas in Germany, disabled people still go to separate schools and therefore are taught separately by teachers with different qualifications. That's as I understand it, Oliver.
Yes.
I think it's very interesting what you've said, because I know when I was going into all these different asylum hospitals, and of course at the beginning it was all about, you know, people being sort of locked away, which was very much how I saw it when I first went into the asylum. And in fact, I'd had to go through these big barriers to even get into the first one, because it was all barricaded off. But what I began to realize the longer I worked on the subject was that they also were safe places, and where people had a sense of being able to have their own identity. And of course, we hear all the horror stories from the asylum hospitals, but there were also some incredible stories about how people were able to actually live a life within a supportive environment. And I know from the whole sense of special schools, they had very many negative elements to it, but they also, if you're in a mainstream school now and you're different, it can be equally difficult if you're not being given the support that you need to thrive and be who you want to be. And I think this collection, to some degree, also highlights some of the issues we're facing now with cutbacks, and how individuals who want to work, who can't work because they're not supported. And there's a whole dialogue coming round again that this collection will be very important to sort of look at and address, and the issues that you've been bringing. How are people represented? You know, a lot of these people within the whole Oscar Helena Heim situation, they actually were working. You know, disabled people want to work. Most of the disabled people I know want to work. And I think that this very massive positivity that Würtz put forward of the representation of disabled people is something that we can actually learn a huge amount from, which you are clearly establishing. I suppose, and another question I would like to ask both of you, as we know, Oliver, you're not a disabled person, but you come from the whole special schools interest. And Oliver and Simon, you are a disabled person. I just sort of I'm interested maybe to say, what was it that drew you originally to these different from your own perspective towards the collection? What was it that interested you to get involved? Obviously, Oliver, you were writing your PhD on it, but what was it that really drew you in? What was the crux of what made you say, I've got to do more about this?
Me personally, I was interested in the history of education, and especially in the history of education when it comes to disability. And Würtz's biography was maybe something like a medium or tool through which I could enter the universe of history. And the collection, I just more or less came across them by accident. It was really an interesting finding, and because during my PhD I was completely focusing on the reconstruction of Würtz's biography.
Very interesting. And Simon, I know Simon very well as an artist, and our paths have crossed as being disabled UK artists. And I can imagine why maybe you were interested, Simon, but what was it that really grabbed you at the beginning?
I think when I first saw the work in 2013, you know, I mean, Oliver skips over quite quickly the fact that he found this collection, and I think it's really important thing to acknowledge. What really struck me was the fact that I was so used to never seeing people who looked different exhibited in a mainstream setting, and all credit to Dock Centre for Contemporary Art for highlighting and showing these works and making me feel that me and my family, my grandfather, my mother, and my father were all disabled people, were actually worth representing. So for me, it was a really kind of like staggering kind of, wow, look. And it wasn't just I was used to that within a contemporary art setting, but certainly it was so much more difficult to look at art history in a historical setting. I mean, within my art training and so on, I'd rarely seen detailed images of a one-armed flower seller. But within my family, I had two relatives who both used prosthetic legs. And here, for the first time, I was seeing beautifully crafted works that represented these people, represented my uncles in a really quite beautiful way. And I think that for me was that personal connection was really quite, wow, that was the big thing.
I actually wish I had seen the collection a long time ago, because for the first 10, 15 years of my career, I hid my disability completely. I was able to, with some difficulty, but I did hide it because there was so much discrimination. And there was so much sense that if I had opened up about what my disability was, I wouldn't have got the commissions or the opportunities that I've been really lucky to receive. And I think it's that sense of visibility, and that actually you're out there in the world. And that certainly it has been very apparent when I've worked abroad, as far as that's concerned. Oliver?
I think we need to open the discussion for
Yeah, we've got some questions. So
I try to answer the question of Oyneshi wrote in the chat, and he asked why intellectual disability or cognitive disability or learning disabilities, however you want to call it, are so underrepresented. Is an underrepresented theme in the collection. And this is the reason why is because Hans-Würtz was very much concentrating on physical disability and with an active exclusion of people with intellectual disabilities. He said, my institution is for people with physical disabilities who can be trained, who can be maybe be workers and stuff. And he was simply not interested in intellectual disability.
There's also the, and we don't know enough about this, but we don't know that whether people with learning disabilities were regularly described visually either. So Velasquez is known for painting people with learning disabilities, but there aren't many outside of this collection within the known history of art. There's not many paintings either of learning disabilities. So there's also the issue that, you know, can we really ask? So if there are ivory carvings of people with limbs that have been lost for whatever reason, are there any ivory carvings of a person with Down syndrome? And of course, we can't conclusively say that. So I think it's a combination of the two. First, wasn't interested, but equally there may equally have been quite a lack of any materials that could have been collected anyway.
But there was just last year, I think, an interesting exhibition. I haven't been there at the Louvre on the history or the figures of the fool was the title, and it's a shame I couldn't see it. But this was more like trying also to make a connection to intellectual disability.
I suppose to a certain degree, then that does come under this category of unseen disabilities. So it's quite difficult for us to necessarily say that none of the figures, some of them may well have had intellectual disabilities, but we can't judge that without any evidence other than looking at the physical situation. I mean, I don't know whether that was something that you looked at when you were actually working with the collection to see if maybe...
Just this afternoon, Rachel, we looked at I discussed a drawing with Oliver, which we think is of two men who may have a learning disability. But because we don't know anything about the context of that image, we are uncertain into how to position it or to frame it. We don't know where the image came from particularly or its nature. And that makes it quite difficult, doesn't it, Oliver? When you see, you know, you might get a glimpse, but it is really just a glimpse.
I mean, I do understand that even from my own work and you know, when I'm abroad, it's one of the most difficult things when people come to workshops or join into projects. The sort of intellectual disabilities are often the ones that are hidden, and often people won't talk about them. From a cultural point of view, it's sometimes easier to have a visible disability in some cultural settings than it is to admit that there's an intellectual disability. So I don't know whether there's a parallel there, going back to the time when Würtz's collection was being made, that there were sensitivities around intellectual disabilities, which would have meant that those things weren't quite so openly talked about or registered. I don't know, of course. I must admit, I did spend a lot of time looking at all the classifications and how you did decide to classify the collection. And I am just wondering if there are any thoughts about what you might have really liked to have there as a classification but you discarded, because I spent a lot of time just looking at how this collection had been put together. So obviously you had to come to some decisions, but were there times where you found it very difficult to really decide that this would be the way you classified with this set of agenda?
I think classifying Rachel medically based on conditions feels quite unpleasant in some respects. But it's incredibly valuable as well. And for me, I found that quite problematic because you're adopting a medical gaze, and I found that quite difficult. But it was useful, wasn't it, Oliver?
Yeah. So, and also it was quite hard to understand what Würtz was thinking, like what category he had this strange, slightly strange categories images belong to. So he has, of course, sometimes you can see it in this book, Break the Crutches. He has some kind of order, but very often we find images and we simply very often didn't know why he put this image in the collection. And then we always ended up, maybe he thought this person is ugly. So it was sometimes really an open question. But this was not like, of course, our goal to reproduce Würtz's systematic or whatever, or to find certain medical diagnosis in the images. This can be an interesting question, but that wasn't our topic. But maybe everyone is, of course, hardly invited to raise questions and comments, and because we only have 10 minutes left, and if someone wants to
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Tim Hayton actually did put a question up, and I think it sort of doesn't directly relate to Würtz's collection, but I can understand that there is a perception and a link to it. And he says the play Richard III, I understand, was written by Shakespeare to endear himself to the Tudor line, Elizabeth I, etc. Do you know anything about how he was received during his life? He received a royal burial, as we now know, though the site of the grave ultimately became Sainsbury's car park. And when I was sort of first read that, I found it quite hard to unpick. But I suppose it is really how Würtz's collection was perceived at the time, but also how it is perceived now. And if there's anything you'd like to add to that, or any thoughts with that, Oliver? And
I just can add that Richard III was Würtz was a big fan of Richard III and of this story, because he thought this is something that is very typical for people with physical disabilities who tend to look inside and reflect themselves and get angry and develop mistrust towards other people. And this was something like a very often cited example for his ideas of crib psychology.
We do have some other questions.
yeah, I've just seen those come in. Amanda has asked, what about art by disabled people? How is that evidenced within the collection?
And Ellie Wright has raised the hand for a minute, so
yeah, I'll catch that one as well.
Amanda, there are some works in the collection by disabled people, but one of the problems we've got with the collection is we don't know the provenance of many of the objects, or nearly all of them. So if we have an original object, even if it's a cut, if it's in a passepartout or picture frame, and we can see the back of it, we can sometimes trace the author and so on, but many times we have no knowledge particularly or estimating. So it's quite difficult to ascertain in fine detail the authorship of every image.
Sarah Babs had directly asked a question about the Down syndrome, which I think was probably clearly answered, but I'll just read it out. And she says, I was interested to see that he didn't appear to have any representation of people with Down syndrome, even though that had been a named condition by then. Any idea why? Also, I wonder what the ugly category meant, which we've sort of discussed, but it's quite a big one because, of course, one of the eugenics issues came into size and really what you look like as well to some degree. So I think it is quite an interesting category because, and that still exists, I feel, within our contemporary society.
Yeah.
I mean, Down syndrome, I think this is maybe the more or less the same answer to the answer of Mr. To the question of Mr. Nash, that he wasn't really interested or focused on cognitive intellectual disabilities. Was not something there are a few images of people with intellectual disabilities in the collection, but very few, and it was just not his topic. And this and the again, please, the ugliness question. I did got that completely.
Also, I wondered what about what the ugly category meant.
This is interesting because, for example, Karl Marx and Schopenhauer and every second philosopher in the European history was in his categories, and very often you find them under the category ugliness. And he links this to what he thinks is something like specialities or a strange looking face. I don't know, big ears, big noses, or stuff like that, or disproportion, whatever. And very often you come to the conclusion when you look at the images that you have to be really a really well-shaped person to not to be part of his collection.
Yeah.
But
I'm going to go to Ellie now because Ellie, would you like to unmute yourself and maybe ask the question directly, if that's possible?
Maybe we have to unmute her.
Maybe let me see. Simon, are you able to do that?
I thought I was, but it's not working. Ellie, I don't know if you're able to ask a question in the chat. But I'm not able to unmute you at the moment. For whatever reason, Ellie, just while we wait.
Ellie, would you be able to send me your question and I'll be able to ask it directly? If you could just send me a text message. I know Ellie, so it'd be really interesting to.
Cool.
Ellie, can you directly unmute? Ellie might not be able to because there's some setting that stops.
Yeah, I can't do it. We have got a question from Philip asking, to what extent does the digital approach require a definitive certainty? How can you include some people have wondered type possibility? And I think, I think what that's getting at is, can we allow within our digital world a more general, a more proximate guide within our database and meta tagging and so on? Only more looser kind of reaction rather than the black and white digital question. I think that's very difficult because the way the technology works is it is very black and white, and it is, yes, that person's that, or it's basically when you're working with thousands of images, we really do just sort of quickly look at an image and add the meta tagging quite quickly, number of people. The meta tagging shows the mix of gender, for instance, the mix of ethnicity, and so on. And it's really quite basic.
I haven't had a message. Sorry.
It's really quite basic. And then we have been asked to consider when are the next dates for exhibition. And Not entirely sure. I'm assuming the next exhibitions will be either in late September 2025 or March 2026. But
And there is, sorry, Simon, there's also due to be a publication at some point. Do you know any time scale of when that may happen?
The publication from the project or our anthology will not be published before. Did you hear me or was I muted?
Yeah, the voices have come back.
Okay.
Now I think we've got. No, I was trying to. My apologies for that. I was trying to unmute Ellie, but it didn't work.
Any more questions? Feel free to use the chat.
There was another question asking about the reading list, and what we can say about to go back to the last but one slide, thanks, was a direct message. Can we go back to the reading list, please? I don't know whether you're able to do that, Simon, but what we do know in the next few weeks, this will have been recorded and you will be able to watch the video and also see the slides in more detail at your own time. So it will be going up on the Warburg website, so you can have a look at their YouTube channel, but you'll get a link to be told about that, anybody who's been actually in the session today.
And you're invited to send us, and sorry, Ash, and we are happy when we receive emails, and when someone is interested, I can send literature along.
That's brilliant. So just to remind everybody, the website for the whole of this project is imagesofdisability.org. And on that website, you'll also see a contact page, which has both Oliver's and Simon's email contact details. And feel very free if anybody has particular questions that they'd like to ask them, or any extra things about the research, which is particularly relevant to anything they might be interested in. Please do go to the website and contact them that way. Another quick one's come up. Is there a way to sign up to get notified when the digitized collection is public?
No, it'll just be notified on the website. That just depends on the development of the project and future funding and so on, because it's such a complicated thing to do. So
but probably if do you have a mailing list which is being developed on the website? People can leave contact details, or not at this stage?
No, it's just basically via our website. Just the notifications we'll keep. We intend to keep that quite up to date over the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think we've now reached 7 o'clock, and I was under strict orders that we should be finishing at 7. So really, for me, I just would like to say a million thanks to Simon and to Oliver for your introduction and for your incredible work on this extraordinary collection. And I'm sure everybody who's been here today really values what you've been doing, and to say thank you very much for the presentations today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening and to stay here with us with our maybe slightly too long presentation.
Well, I loved it, so thank you very much.
And also just to conclude, Rachel, I'd like to thank you for chairing everything, for keeping us on time and looking after us. Thank you so much for what you've done. And of course,
well, I'm very, very happy to be play a little role within this project, because it's been really invaluable for my research, but also for future things that are going on in the whole disability arts world. So I really appreciate that you've done this extraordinary work, and to get funding for it, which is also extraordinary in this particular era. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you everyone who's taken the time to be part of our session today. We value the time you've given us, and to just spread the word about the collection and highlight where they can find any information if they're interested. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.